And here we are at a familiar place. Rudy Giuliani walking back what he told the New York Times, that until the day Trump won the election, he was still negotiating over a Trump Tower skyscraper in Moscow, and then making a bizarre reference to tapes. That is in an interview with The New Yorker. Giuliani's point was to push back on BuzzFeed's reporting that Trump directed former fixer Michael Cohen to lie to Congress, saying, quote, "I have been through all the tapes. I have been through all the texts. I have been through all the emails, and I knew none existed," showing an order from the president to lie. Wait, tapes? Big red flag for the interviewer, who then, of course, asked about those tapes. Well, Giuliani responded, "I shouldn't have said tapes. No tapes. Well, I have listened to tapes, but none of them concern this." Just a short time ago, a senior administration official told NBC News that Giuliani's comments are, quote, "not helping," adding about the former New York mayor's TV appearances, quote, "if nothing good can come of it, don't do it." And the president's son went on Fox News saying he has no idea when the talks ended.
I don't know. I don't talk about things that I don't know about. But, you know, unfortunately, that sometimes happens, and no different than anyone else. But the reality is this wasn't a deal. You know, we don't know the developer. We don't know the site. We don't know anything about it.
It wasn't a deal. Let's fact check that, because then businessman Trump tweeted about a potential project in 2013. And in fact, Trump signed a letter of intent to pursue the deal in 2015, a letter obtained by CNN, and met with a developer for the project, according to the Wall Street Journal. Joining me now, former federal prosecutor Elliot Williams and NBC News legal analyst Danny Cevallos. Hardly know where to begin, but Elliot, let's start with Rudy Giuliani. First, he told Chuck Todd on Meet the Press that the Trump Tower talks went all the way up to 2016. Then he said it was all hypothetical. How does something like that fly with federal prosecutors?
Oh, not very well, because it's conflicting evidence and it's conflicting stories. You know, I think the bigger question here, New York Magazine, not The New Yorker, did an article today raising the question of, is Rudy Giuliani a genius or an idiot, using those words, not mine. And the question is, you know, is this a deliberate strategy to throw people off the scent in the investigation, or is he just confused? It's almost Shakespearean, where, like in King Lear, the character of the fool is the genius in the whole play. And maybe he is. Who knows? But back to your question, how do federal prosecutors deal with this? Again, this is an individual presenting himself as the lawyer for the president of the United States, making conflicting statements and not doing his client any good. Even if he's joking, as the New Yorker article says at one point he is, lawyers know that words matter, and even jokes that are out there in the ether can come back to bite the president and bite the client. So he is not doing the president a great service here. Yeah,
either way, Danny, it would seem to me, whether he's a genius or maybe one of the worst lawyers ever to go on television, neither way is he seeming to be helping his client.
That's right. And if there is a strategy, that is exactly the problem. The more Rudy talks, the more he potentially reveals strategy, attorney-client communications, even work product, his mental impressions, things that he has come up with that are information that he is only privy to. The problem is that Rudy Giuliani, as a defense attorney, occupies a very unique position. It's not like being a mayor when you speak for the people of the city. It's not like being a prosecutor when you speak for the government. Defense attorneys speak for their client. Often they are the only voice for their client, and they can bind their client, which is why, generally speaking, defense attorneys should speak to the press sparingly. This is a case study in what happens when a defense attorney rambles on and rambles on.
That's what he was hired to do, apparently. He was hired to put the administration.
That's correct.
He's essentially hired to do PR, not to do law.
That's exactly right. And that's the challenge. If he's serving that dual role as PR and defense attorney, he is speaking directly for his client and potentially binding him. And when people do that, as anyone in PR would tell you, you must have a command of the facts. And I should add, you should never rely solely on your client as a source regardless of those facts.
The other thing that continues to strike me about all of this, and this is just one example of it, Elliot, what we heard from Donald Trump Jr., is that he tries to say there was no deal, when in fact there is documentation that they were working toward a deal, that there's plenty of testimony suggesting that they were working on a deal. And then he makes it sound like he is not a key figure in what is a very tiny company, so he couldn't possibly know everything. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out what impact these different voices have when you're trying to conduct an investigation.
He also, I believe in that same interview, distanced himself from Michael Cohen, saying that he was this bit player who never did anything for the Trump Organization, which we know is factually untrue. It is just a false statement that Michael Cohen did nothing for the Trump Organization, or the President of the United States.
Yeah, and how do you sign a letter of intent and say there was never anything that was a deal?
How do you tweet saying, thank you, there's going to be Trump Tower Moscow? I mean, we roll our eyes and we laugh at the tweets, but they're creating this massive evidentiary record that, frankly, are going to be used in court documents or pleadings at some point, because the president is on the record verifying or disputing facts that are out there in the public discussion. And so I don't know how he does it, given that, I mean, again, forget what Mueller has, forget what's in the emails or whatever, or the tapes. Lordy, I hope there are tapes. Forget all of that. We have seen the tweets, and they confirm some of this information. So it is puzzling that Junior is out there saying the things he is.
What are those tapes and what's on them? Elliot Williams, Danny Savalos. Maybe we'll find out one of these days.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.